Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the monumental year of 1453 and exploring the downright bizarre afterlife of obsolete city walls. Seriously, have you ever wondered what actually happens to massive defensive boundaries when they're, well, just not needed anymore? When history marches forward and technology renders a giant stone fortress completely useless. Today, we're going to unpack the fascinating, almost biological life cycle of these massive urban structures. We'll trace their journey from being the ultimate protectors of civilization to becoming chaotic, vibrant scars right in the middle of our modern cities.
But to really grasp the profound shift we're talking about today, we first have to understand how deeply ingrained walls are in our collective human psyche. Take this profound 14th century idea. What has a wall around it? That we call a city. For centuries, physical boundaries entirely defined early human civilization. Think about it. A city wasn't just a collection of houses. It was a legally and physically enclosed fortress. If you didn't have a wall, you didn't have a city. You just had a vulnerable village.
And you know, this psychological link goes back so much further than the 14th century. It's existed since the very dawn of written language. Just picture an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph depicting a town. It's literally drawn as two intersecting crossroads completely encircled by a wall. This wasn't just a physical reality for them, it was their whole identity. The wall separated the citizens from the outsiders, the civilized world from the wild, the safe from the incredibly dangerous.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at 1453, the turning point. Second, the intellectual shockwave. Third, the life cycle of walls. Fourth, the age of obsolescence. And finally, we'll look at Istanbul's urban fissure.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, 1453, the turning point.
The year is 1453. The famous land walls of Constantinople are finally breached, acting as a massive, world-altering, inciting incident in history. For centuries, these incredibly complex, multi-layered walls had withstood countless sieges. They were the ultimate symbol of security. But the Ottoman forces brought something to the table that changed the rules of architecture and warfare forever: massive siege cannons. The sheer kinetic force of gunpowder artillery proved once and for all that no vertical stone wall, no matter how ridiculously thick or high, could guarantee your safety anymore.
Which brings us to part 2, the intellectual shockwave. Because this breach wasn't just physical. When Constantinople fell, fleeing scholars carried ancient Greek texts out of the city and straight into Western Europe. And the before and after contrast here is absolutely staggering. Before 1453, much of educated society was heavily constrained by strict religious doctrine. But suddenly, this huge intake of ancient Greek literacy essentially sparks the Renaissance. It replaced dogma with logical knowledge, radically transforming politics, economics, and human evolution as we know it. So the physical destruction of that wall literally seeded the intellectual rebirth of Europe. Crazy, right?
Let's move on to part 3, the life cycle of walls.
Having seen that massive intellectual impact, let's zoom back in on the physical walls themselves. They actually have a fascinating life cycle of their own. Military historian Karl von Clausewitz broke this down into 3 crucial phases. First, walls serve a pure defensive function, literally just keeping out immediate threats. Second, they evolve into strategic strongholds used to control vast regions of territory. And finally, inevitably, stage 3 hits: technological obsolescence. Once cannons like the ones used in 1453 were perfected, standing behind a tall stone wall went from being your best defense to a literal death trap.
So as cannons and assault artillery arrived on the scene, walls had to fundamentally change shape. They couldn't be these tall, proud symbols of power anymore. They had to be significantly lowered, thickened, and hidden. Massive ditches or moats were added to keep enemy artillery at a distance. Defense stopped being about a vertical barrier and morphed into a wide, horizontal zone. But even these massive adaptations couldn't save them forever. By the 19th century, city walls were entirely, completely obsolete.
And that ushers in part 4, the age of obsolescence.
Because they completely lost their military purpose, these massive stone structures started taking on surprisingly relatable everyday civilian roles. They transformed into filters for goods and money. City gates became customs checks and tax collection nodes. The tops of the walls, citizens repurposed them into open promenades just to catch the summer breeze. The land just outside the walls became free enterprise zones, hosting activities that were way too noisy or dirty for the inner city. And honestly, the best part, the rather ironic part, is that the terrifying defensive moats originally designed to drown invaders became hosts to bow-stands or vibrant vegetable gardens right on the fringes of the city. Turns out, a former death trap makes absolutely excellent soil for cabbages. Finally, we arrive at part 5, Istanbul's urban fissure.
This brings us to the ultimate concrete example of what happens to obsolete architecture, the modern fate of Istanbul's land walls. We're talking about imposing structures stretching a massive 7 kilometers long. For 15 long centuries, this marked the strict, unquestionable western edge of Istanbul. For 1,500 years, if you stood on one side, you were in the imperial capital. If you took a few steps to the other side, you were in the countryside. It was a definitive, absolute edge.
But today? Today they are no longer an edge. They're what urban planners define as an urban fissure, a massive, disruptive slice right through the middle of the urban fabric. See, because the city eventually exploded outward, it couldn't easily erase a 7-kilometer stone structure, so it simply grew around it. The wall became a giant historical scar. It creates this totally uncertain space where ancient history collides directly with modern everyday life.
It's honestly staggering to think about watching a city literally swallow its own ancient boundaries whole. Back in 1946, that boundary was the definitive edge. It bordered nothing but empty land. But fast forward to 2005, and that exact same line is completely engulfed by vast westward expansion. The massive barrier that once protected the city from the outside world is now trapped deep inside it.
And here is the ultimate historical irony. These terrifying ancient defenses are now stuck squarely in the middle of the city, regulated by an absolute administrative nightmare of 3 different municipal bureaucracies: Fatih on the eastern side, Zeytinburnu to the west, and Eyüp to the north. And what actually happens in this fissure today? It hosts a chaotic, beautifully human mix of cemeteries, modern hospitals, informal pop-up markets, and vacant lots. A structure built to enforce absolute, rigid order now hosts completely unscripted, organic urban life.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a thought. Sure, we no longer build stone walls with massive moats to keep out cannons, but look at your own town, your own city, and ask yourself, what invisible walls, economic divides, or historical fissures do you navigate every single day? We may have left the stone walls of 1453 behind, but the human instinct to draw lines and build enclosures, that's as alive as ever. Thank you so much for joining me, and I encourage you to look at your own city's map with fresh eyes today.